So we're going to begin our lecture on Italy in the 16th century. And this is a really cool lecture because this is the time where we're looking at experimentation. Earlier on in the 14th century, we're emerging from the Dark Ages and we're going into this new idea of humanism. Then we've got the 15th century where we're looking at all the technical skills and all those wonderful inventions such as perspective and chiaroscuro come into play. And now those have been around for a while, and we're starting to see the greatest artists beginning to experiment. So the 16th century, or the 1500s, is known as the late or the high Renaissance. But we normally focus on a specific range of years. 1495 is the beginning, because that's when Da Vinci sets to work on the Last Supper, to 1527, which is where we have the fall of Rome. And that's the greatest years of artistic achievement during the High Renaissance. After 1527, most of the remaining artists are going to be working up in Venice. But we will be back to Rome in the next lecture during the Baroque age. This is also the time period where we have the best known works of art being produced and the leading artists of the era. Here's where we have Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. This is also a time period where we have Machiavelli, who was expelled from public life when the Medici returned to power in 1512. And he writes that famous book, The Prince, which is still in print today. And he hopes to gain their favor once again, but instead they have him imprisoned. The sack of Rome, or what I call the second fall of Rome, occurs in 1527, led by troops of Charles V. It's been called a 6-month orgy of killing, looting, and burning. During that time, 10,000 people are killed, and Rome's population declines by 80%. Up in England, Henry VIII splits the Roman Catholic Church. We have our very first art history book. In 1550, Giorgio Vasari writes the Lives of the Artists. And what this is a story of exactly that. We have a book that begins with Cimabue meeting Giotto out in a field. We have some of the story about Botticelli. Vasari considers his time, though, to be the apex of artistic achievement. And he happens to be correct. Now, Vasari's best friend, that's Michelangelo, and about a quarter of the book is devoted to him. We're also having a location shift once again. In the 1400s, we were in Florence. Now it's the 1500s, and we're going to be particularly in the Vatican. Also of note during this time period is we have the official switch from painting with tempera to painting in oil. We also have using canvas rather than using wood. And also more private commissions, which means that we have less dependence upon the church as a patron. So the first artist we'll look at is Leonardo da Vinci. And he's got this great quote, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." And when we look at the history of artists, we can look at Vincent van Gogh and say that he produced around 2,000 artworks. Picasso, at least 15,000. Da Vinci, about 20. That's all that he did. He actually walked away from more works than he completed. He went to work for the workshop of Verrocchio. And this is the artist from our last chapter who was one of the famed artists who created sculptures for the exterior of the Orsan Michele. And his work was called Doubting Thomas. He was a bronze sculptor and also a painter. So Da Vinci, even though he is known today as a painter, absolutely he was also taught in how to cast bronze. The very first time we have Da Vinci as part of an artwork, creating it, is the baptism of Christ off to the right. Those two angels in the lower left-hand corner of the painting, those are by Da Vinci. Later on, he does these two altarpieces, and you can see how different they are. And you can also start to see the kind of mindset Da Vinci had. The first one is off to the left, and there are about 25 years in between these two works. But the one at the left here, he was told to create an altarpiece with the Madonna and Child and two angels. And you can automatically tell that he did not do that. We have the Madonna, we have a child, we have an extra child here, and then we have also another figure off to the right. But we don't know if she's really an angel or not. In the second image, we can definitely see that we've got the Madonna and Child. To the left of the Madonna is St. John the Baptist, and we can tell that by the cross. The figure at the right now has wings, so we can definitely attribute her as an angel. And we've also got some atmospheric perspective working in the background off to the left. In 1495, Da Vinci is going to create his most famed work, The Last Supper. It's been lampooned over the centuries, this one by Andy Warhol. And by the way, Andy Warhol never saw the original Last Supper because it was under restoration when he was in Milan. So his work is really based on a print that his mother had in their family kitchen. Up top, we have The Simpsons lampooning The Last Supper, and down below, you can be buried in a Last Supper casket, this one by Peninsular Caskets, and it will only set you back around $2,500. Or we can also be placed under 15 hours worth of needlework to create a Last Supper tattoo. A lot of people will tell you that the Last Supper is in Rome, and it's really not. It's up in Milan at this church, the Santa Maria della Grazia. And it was commissioned by the Duke of Milan, Duke Sforza, who would have lunch here. And in this room, he would look up and see this blank wall. And so he ended up giving it to Da Vinci as a consolation prize. Unfortunately, he had to take another commission away from him. We'll cover that shortly. So here's the room that the Last Supper is in. The Last Supper itself is about 15 feet by 30 feet. Think of it as a gigantic oil painting mural. And this room is also significant because this is where Napoleon housed his horses, literally using it as a stable during his campaigns in Italy during the 1700s. Now, Da Vinci begins painting The Last Supper around 1494. He gets the commission, officially brushed to wall in 1495, and he's 42 years old. Now, this is significant because at the time, life expectancy was about 40. So if Da Vinci had passed away at 40, we would not even be talking about him today. Other artists, such as Raphael, dies at 36. Domenico Ghirlandaio, the teacher of Michelangelo, dies at 45. So when we look back at who were the best painters in Italy in the 1400s, it's Pietro Perugino, a person we rarely even talk about today. He was the one who led the dream team of painters who painted the walls of the Sistine Chapel, and we'll be looking at him later on in this lecture. The second best painter, Pinturicchio. He was also one of the artists who painted the walls of the Sistine Chapel and worked primarily for Pope Alexander VI. As far as third place, that's where everyone else was. There was no specific third best painter in Italy. No one knew who Leonardo was, and this is because he had not completed any notable public works. He had a couple private commissions that were completed, but that was really about all. He abandoned many works of art that would have given him that fame that he really deserved. But he had other interests. So those other interests included geometry, architecture, anatomy, fortifications, and implements of war. So when I think back on Da Vinci himself, rarely do I ever associate him with being an artist. It was definitely a hobby for him, and this is really where his interest was held. If you asked him if he could only do one thing, what would he like to do for the rest of his life? It would be to build fortifications. Unfortunately for Da Vinci, he had kind of a bad reputation. In fact, he had been sued by people in the past because he did not complete his work. And the last thing you would want is to hire him to build or design a fortification around your city and then to have him walk off the job. We do have Da Vinci's resume. It is one of the first resumes ever created. He sent this to the Duke of Milan, Duke Sforza, letting the Duke know that he was a very trained civil engineer, and he had methods of blowing up fortresses. He knew how to create underground tunnels, and he could also create fire-throwing engines of both practical and beautiful design. To give you an idea of this crossbow here, you can see that individual off to the right-hand side, how gigantic this would have been. It's only at the end of the resume that Da Vinci states that I can carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay. And in painting, I can do any kind of work, as well as any man, whoever he may be. Unfortunately, though, that last statement about painting is a lie. And so, not unlike our resumes today, he takes time to fudge his qualifications and exaggerate his abilities. He was not a fresco painter. And during this time in Italy, that was one of the most important things to be able to know how to do. And in fact, fresco painters were looked at as the very top rung of painters. People like Cimabue, for instance, and Giotto, Ghirlandaio. These were all fresco painters. The Duke hires Da Vinci to create what's going to be known as the Sforza horse. Unfortunately, the Duke decides to go to war. And in wartime, you need that metal for cannons, not sculpture. And so he gets the commission taken away from him. And that's why he gets the Last Supper, is because this is kind of like a secondary commission that the Duke would like him to do. All we have remaining are some of the drawings for the Sforza horse. The one that we just saw here by Nina AKAMU, she was able to complete 2 of these, one in the Hippodrome in Paris, and I believe the other one is in Milan. But you can imagine, this would have been the largest equestrian monument, the largest bronze sculpture during the Renaissance. And this work alone would have cemented Da Vinci in as one of the greatest artists ever to have lived. So in 1495, we finally get the beginnings of the Last Supper. Unfortunately, you can see all the disrepair that this is in. If this had been done in true fresco, which, by the way, not only was Da Vinci not trained in it, it wouldn't have suited his personality. With fresco painting, you have to be very ordered, moving from one space to the next adjoining space. And Da Vinci was someone who would be like, I'm going to work on the ceiling one day, the table the next, one of the figures the next day. And that's not going to be what fresco painting is. So this work is a gigantic oil painting mural. Only about 20% of the original paint remains. That's why these figures, when you zoom into them, have a very ghostly look. As soon as it was finished, within 20 years, people started noticing how damaged it had already become. Now, when it was first unveiled, it was an absolute masterpiece. Everyone talked about it, and it was a very important work of art. But you can automatically see on this work here that we've got a doorway that's right through the Last Supper. The monks, what would happen is, on the other side of this wall is the kitchen. and the stoves were right up against this wall. So the constant heating and cooling of the wall caused the paint to peel prematurely. The monks also complained about the time it took to get the food from the kitchen down the hallway into the refectory. And they decided to just build a doorway right through into the kitchen, not even concerned about Da Vinci's painting. We are lucky to have this work at all today because a bomb did destroy this building during World War II. And so here's an image of that right after the bomb blast. The Last Supper is on the wall that's kind of in the center of the work, a little bit off to the right, and it has sandbags in front of it. That's the only reason we have it today. It is absolutely a work that's in linear perspective, and when we look at the invention of linear perspective in the last century, it really made that entire artistic generation switch into something that was very ordered, very formulaic. If you were a painter during this age, you had to comply to the rules of linear perspective. And this is something that you'll see continuing all the way up into the mid-1800s. Then we also have a completed work. This is one of his earlier works that was in private hands. It's a painting of Cecilia Gallerani, who is also known as the Lady with an Ermine. And this is a work that we'll also see during the art theft lecture later in the semester. The Mona Lisa, by far the icon of Western art history. It's funny to think that she was not incredibly famous until after she was stolen in 1911 and found again in 1913. And I'll cover that story as well later on in the semester. It's a little underwhelming to visit her because the painting itself is rather small. It is done on panel, it is done in oil paint, and today it sits behind bulletproof glass. But look at how many people go and want to take a picture of her. The reason she is such a shocking and important painting is that it's the first time we see a shift in portraiture. Up until the 1500s, you're going to have a profile picture as your portrait. You are not going to engage the viewer at all. You're not going to be looking at the viewer. And look at how high the painting is on the person. It just barely goes to showing the shoulder. In the Mona Lisa, it's what's called a three-quarter view. It's almost down to her waist. It's a unique work. You know, there's a nondescript landscape in the back. The figure itself is not wearing any jewelry. There's been a lot of theories about this being Leonardo da Vinci's mother, Leonardo da Vinci in drag. We do know that it is a Florentine banker's wife. Her name was Lisa Giardini Giacondo. And it's also, for me, a very unique work because this was a very wealthy person who had a portrait of his wife completed, but she's not wearing any jewelry. You'll also notice that she doesn't have any eyebrows. She did originally, but during the 1600s, when this painting was cleaned, a person used the wrong solvent and cleaned them off. I'm not a huge fan of the Mona Lisa myself, but I do think she's fascinating for a couple of reasons. Number one is the insurance value. This painting is insured, and this is several years ago, was insured for $750 million. And of course, this is a priceless painting. Besides the technical aspect of having the sitter engage with the viewer, this is really a painting that also never saw its completion by giving it back to the person who first commissioned the work. Da Vinci kept this painting with him his entire life. In 1514, he ends up selling it to the King of France, King Francis I. But then Da Vinci goes and lives in the court of Francis I for the last 5 years of his life. Da Vinci's going to pass away around 1519. And there's also no known notes about this painting. And of course, Da Vinci is such a prolific note taker. Vincenzo Perugia, he's the one that stole the Mona Lisa. Again, I'll cover him in a later lecture. And originally we thought that the Mona Lisa may have been Isabella d'Este. And this is an unfinished work by Da Vinci. Isabella d'Este had sat for this painting. She was waiting for it. She sent a messenger to find out what was taking Da Vinci so long to complete this work. And the messenger came back and said, basically, you're never going to get your work back. Da Vinci is tired of painting. And so, unfortunately, this painting never gets completed. So now we're going to move on to Raphael. And Raphael is mostly noted today for his wonderful interpretations of the Madonna. This is not at all like the Madonna and Child portrait that we saw by Giotto or any of the artists prior to the 16th century. The image at the left here is much more of a true painting of a mother and child, something that's more indicative of a painting style by Mary Cassatt, which we see in the 1800s. The only indication that the images by Raphael are of the Madonna is this very slight halo here off to the upper left, and also the Church of San Bernardino there in the background, which is located in Tuscany. Here's another Madonna painting, and this one I put up just to show you what happens once a painting is cleaned. This was a painting that had 500 years of dirt on it, and it had been cleaned in 2007. And so, such an incredibly vast difference. And look at those bright colors. They almost pop when you look at them. One of the terms you might also see or come across in the textbook of this age is a tondi. And a tondi is just a circular painting. It's a circular formatted painting, which is something we don't see all that often, but Raphael does it, Michelangelo does it, and particularly this painting here, you'll actually see it in a lot of television shows in the background, hanging on the wall. I'm sure it's copies of it are in the prop house at, for instance, Universal. You see it in a lot of their TV series. This is Raphael's painting of Pope Julius II. And Pope Julius II was responsible for bringing Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling. He also did a major reconstruction of St. Peter's Cathedral and also brought Raphael from Florence to the Vatican to paint his personal apartments. This is the library here. These are fresco paintings, and each wall was painted with one of the domains of knowledge. Those domains included poetry, law, religion, and finally philosophy. This is the most famous of the four paintings. It's also better known as the School of Athens. This is a make-believe scene that spans centuries, where you have the greatest philosophers, naturalists, mathematicians in one place at one time. You have people like this person here. We've got Plato, we've got Aristotle, we've got Socrates. The person holding the globe of the universe, that's the astronomer Ptolemy. Here is Raphael sneaking out from behind. I'll show you a little bit more of a detail of that in just a moment. We've got Pythagoras over here illustrating his theorems. And down here in the center, or near center, we have Michelangelo leaning on a block of marble. What's exciting about this work is literally 20 feet away from where Raphael is painting this scene, Michelangelo is painting the Sistine ceiling. So these two fresco cycles are going on at the exact same time. Now, the story goes that Raphael snuck over to the Sistine Chapel one evening after Michelangelo left and saw that he had just finished painting an angel in this pose. And he runs back and he paints Michelangelo there leaning on a block of marble and writing, and invites Michelangelo to see what he created on the very next day. And this, of course, totally upset Michelangelo, because his worst fears were realized that someone had broken in and seen his creation before it was unveiled. And it's also unique to think that Michelangelo is known so much as a sculptor, which is why we have this block of marble here. And at this time, he is being enlisted as a painter to paint the ceiling of the chapel. In fact, this is really Michelangelo's first time painting in fresco, is on the Sistine ceiling. What's also great about Raphael is he was kind of a everyday kind of guy, and he got a lot of work from different popes. He got a lot of work from government officials. He was quite the ladies' man, and he would also be someone you would want to sit down and have a beer with. In this painting here, he even includes some of his best friends. Plato here is not just a version of Plato. This is Leonardo da Vinci. Ptolemy is not only the astronomer, but he is the architect Bramante, who is working on the reconstruction of St. Peter's Cathedral, which you kind of see here in the background. And there's the close-up of Raphael there. This is one of only 3 times where you see him painting a self-portrait. And unfortunately, Raphael dies very young at the age of 37. He is such a popular artist. He is given a state funeral and buried in the Pantheon. And now we're going to move on to Michelangelo. So Michelangelo is one of those artists whose name is linked to the creation of wonderful art. When he was a young boy, he would go to the Brancacci Chapel in Florence and copy the works of Masaccio. That was one of his earliest inspirations. He also grew up pretty much in the Medici household. They immediately saw the talent of this young boy and adopted him. There were 2 young Medici boys also of the same age. And so you can imagine Michelangelo sitting at a table with Lorenzo the Magnificent and hearing him talk with other artists such as Botticelli. By the time he's 14, he starts working as an apprentice in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who is the one who teaches him how to do fresco painting. Unfortunately, Michelangelo is a very difficult person to get along with. Even after he emerged from the workshop of Ghirlandaio, he said he never learned anything from this master. By the time he's 23, he has created his very first monumental sculptural work, the Pietà. The Pietà translates into pity in Italian, and this is Mary mourning over the body of Christ. Originally, this would have been sitting on the floor of St. Peter's Cathedral. The sculpture itself is 6 foot tall, and so you would be staring into the face of Mary, looking down at the body of Christ along with her and mourning. Of course, a couple things that are wrong in terms of this sculpture is that it is gigantic. It is Mary 6 feet tall sitting down. And we've also got a very youthful face. So these aren't mistakes that Michelangelo has made, but it's just a very different interpretation of this scene. So Mary looks to be around 30 when she should be around 50. But look at the way that the face is rendered, the way the fall of the textiles are, the tenderness of the fingers pressing into flesh. But we have to realize that this is not flesh, that it's actual rock. The natural fall of the hands, and again the tie of the drapery. makes this sculpture look so real and authentic. Now, as I mentioned, it was supposed to sit on the floor of St. Peter's Cathedral, which it did for many, many years. Unfortunately, today it is up on a pedestal. It is behind bulletproof glass. One of the reasons for this was back in 1972, I believe it was, this guy LAZLO TOTH, who is being escorted down from the Pietà right here, runs into the Vatican, and he jumps over the balustrade, rushes past the guards. The entire time he is carrying a sledgehammer and screaming, quote, "I am Jesus Christ." He jumps up on top of the Pietà and is able to land 15 hits to it before he is forcibly stopped. He breaks the Madonna's left arm, and also several bashes to the head and the eyebrow particularly are damaged. The profession of LAZLO TOTH, he was a college professor. He taught geometry in Hungary. He went to an Italian psychiatric hospital for observation, stayed there for 6 months, was released, no charges filed. The last time anyone saw him, he was getting on a plane to Australia. That's the last of our knowledge about him. Were he alive today, in 2020, you're looking at he'd probably be in his early to mid-80s now. Michelangelo was so involved in the process of his sculptures that he would go to the rock quarries at Carrara to hand pick out the blocks that he was going to carve. He said that these sculptures lived within these blocks, and all that was needed to set them free were his tools. We have several incomplete works by Michelangelo, so you can kind of see the progression of how they're worked on, and also what unfinished marble looks like. All of these were set to adorn the tomb of Pope Julius II. This would have been a gigantic tomb, not unlike the Egyptian pharaohs. The idea that while you were alive, your tomb would be created. And unfortunately for Pope Julius II, he ran into some money problems rebuilding St. Peter's Cathedral, and this project never got completed during his lifetime. He was also told by some other people, probably plotting against Michelangelo and the greatness of what this work would have been, that it was bad luck to create your tomb during your lifetime. We do have a few finished sculptures. There were originally going to be 27 just on the ground floor. This is a 3-story tall tomb, and would have been set right here across from the baldacchino. Now, during Pope Julius's reign, the baldacchino did not exist. This marks the center spot of St. Peter's Cathedral. This is the spot where St. Peter is buried. However, the baldacchino is a Baroque structure. It was created in the early 1600s. So this is about a century before that, and this would have been just off, the tomb of Julius II would have been just off center. This is what the Pope actually got, still by Michelangelo, still made out of marble. You can see several of the sculptures were for the original tomb, such as the sculpture of Moses here. But it is in a different church, St. Peter's in Vincoli. A couple years later, we get the monolithic David by Michelangelo. If you've never seen it in person, it is roughly 17 feet high, and that is above the pedestal, and the pedestal is roughly 6 feet. We do have some issues with this sculpture today in terms of conservation. This area of the ankle is very, very thin, and because of the weight of the sculpture, it's beginning to form some cracks. So conservationists are trying to figure out ways that we can preserve this sculpture so that no further damage happens to it. Originally, it was planned to go on top of the Florence Cathedral, but when it was unveiled, it was thought to be so beautiful. And keep in mind, David is the patron saint of this city during the Renaissance age. So when it was unveiled, it was thought to be so beautiful, it was meant to be put in a more public area where the people could get a better view of it, and it was placed right outside the Palazzo Vecchio. Keep in mind how different it is from Donatello's David of just a century earlier. Think about the mediums that these were created in, the idea that the sculpture of Michelangelo was a public commission compared to Donatello's being a private commission for the Medici family. The size of the sculpture at the left, 17 feet, compared to a 5-foot 2-inch bronze sculpture. The age of David, and also the different part of the story that's being told. In Michelangelo's version, where David is seeing Goliath from the distance. And now we're going to go into the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Sistine Chapel sure doesn't look like much from the outside, especially when it's situated right next to St. Peter's Cathedral. But it's absolutely stunning on the inside. The structure itself is about 7,000 square feet. And it's named for Pope Sixtus IV. So this is where we get the Sistine Chapel. The birth name of Pope Sixtus IV is Francesco della Rovere. And here's a map of Rome of roughly what we're looking at, and this will help us also with a few structures we're going to see in some later lectures. On the left-hand side of the Tiber is St. Peter's Cathedral. The Sistine Chapel is right next to it. It's literally attached. And then we have, over on the right-hand side, we have the Colosseum, St. Peter's and Vincoli, which is where Pope Julius II ends up getting buried. We just saw his original tomb and then what he actually got. That's here. San Carlo of the Four Fountains. That's going to be seen during the lecture of the Baroque, such as the Church of Santa Susanna. The Church of St. Ignatius has an absolutely beautiful barrel vault where we see St. Ignatius rising up into heaven to meet Christ. And of course, the famed Pantheon from Roman history. Here's a little bit more of a close-up. Again, we can see St. Peter's Cathedral, the arms of the church, and then we have the Sistine Chapel right next to it on the north-hand side. And there it is. So the Sistine Chapel is a military structure. Its walls are 3 meters thick, meaning that they can withstand cannon fire. You can have archers set up in these battlements here, and also they can pour down hot boiling oil on anyone trying to attack the chapel. Before Michelangelo started, the ceiling was very much like many other chapels where it was just a blue sky with stars to emulate heaven. It's really the side walls that were the most impressive because that was where the most easily seen paintings are going to be placed. Painters like Pietro Perugino, who we saw previously in this lecture. He's the one who created the painting of the delivery of the keys to St. Peter, and Christ confers upon him the title of the very first pope. A work that's absolutely in linear perspective. Now, this painting holds special significance as well, because when the cardinals go to vote on who is going to become the next pope, the person who generally has the bed underneath this painting in the Sistine Chapel, that's where all the cardinals go to congregate to vote on who the next pope is going to be, the person who has their bed or cot underneath this painting generally becomes the very next pope. And so that painting kind of has some symbolic significance. Botticelli was also one of the artists who worked on the walls of the Sistine Chapel in his work of the Temptation of Christ. Domenico Ghirlandaio, the teacher of Michelangelo, completed the Calling of the Apostles. From 1508 to 1512, Michelangelo paints the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And of course, here is probably the most famed fresco painting of the entire Renaissance age. It is from the book of Genesis, and it also begins over the altar wall and proceeds to the entrance or exit door. Now, a lot of people think Michelangelo created scaffolding, laid on his back to create these works, but he really did so in a standing position. And it comes from a misinterpretation of the word for leaning back. It was originally translated into on the back, but then it was retranslated into leaning back. Now, Michelangelo also hated painting the Sistine Chapel. He complained for 4 solid years, telling people that he was a sculptor, not a painter. He even wrote songs, or actually wrote sonnets, about how much he hated this job. He even for a while totally quit and escaped back to Florence in the middle of the night, only to be forced to return to finish this job. Right over the altar we have the creation of the sun, moon, and planets. Then we have the separation of land from water, the creation of Adam, creation of Eve, temptation and expulsion, and then the last 3 frames are of the story of Noah, the sacrifice, the deluge, and look at that ark back in the water here, a rendering of the Sistine Chapel, letting you know the church is the way to salvation. And finally, the drunkenness of Noah. Now in 1527 we have the sack of Rome, where Rome is completely destroyed. It's going to take many decades to resurrect the city. The remaining artists flee to Venice, and we're going to look at some Venetian works, and we're also going to look at a term called mannerism. The first artist we're going to look at is Giorgione, and this is his famous work called The Tempest. And you can immediately see how different and how strange this painting is. There's no narrative that we know of that really fulfills this scene in this painting. When it was sold at auction in the 1700s, literally 200 years after it was completed, it was sold as a landscape scene with gypsy woman and soldier. But when we take a closer look at this work, we have a nondescript city in the background, a storm brewing on the horizon with that lightning bolt shining through. We've got a matronly nude image of a figure off to the right, and then we have a German mercenary soldier off to the left. Just to his right, we have some unfinished architecture. When we x-rayed this painting, we found it was even more confusing because we have another nude figure off in the lower left. That German mercenary soldier had been painted later. Giorgione is also famous for this work of Sleeping Venus. Now, this work is also the basis for one of his famous students' work. And his student was named Titian. And like Donatello, Titian lived well into his 80s, so he created a tremendous amount of work. And behind Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael, I would tell you that Titian was the 4th greatest artist of the Renaissance. With the Venus of Urbino, we're not quite sure whether she is a courtesan for the Duke or if it is his bride. And we have some theories about her being his bride because of the matrimonial chest that you see the figures looking in the back right. The fact that she's holding leaves of heather and also of roses, which symbolize the marriage. And at the foot of the bed, we have a sleeping dog, the symbol of fidelity. A lot of people think these Renaissance works are always incredibly large. This one is not. That's how it looks in the gallery. And Titian, of course, does do tremendously large works, in this case, the Assumption and Consecration of the Virgin. Remember, this is up in Venice, and you cannot do fresco painting because of the moisture in the air from all the water. So, we have a lot of oil paintings. This one, 22 feet in height. It's one of the works that is considered in situ, which means in its original location. It was placed here around the mid to late 1500s and 22.5 feet in height. And that was the Santa Maria dei Ferrari Cathedral. One of my favorite artists of the Venetian Renaissance was Paolo Veronese. Veronese painted this work called Feast in the House of Levi, and this is an absolutely gigantic painting. This is how big it is. 18 feet high, 42 feet wide, and when he painted this, it upset a lot of people. The Inquisition called Veronese in front of them and was told to account for his rendering of Christ in the presence of, quote, Germans, drunkards, and dwarves, which his company Christ would not have kept according to them. And so they demanded that he change this painting. And because this was not the original title of this painting, the painting was a Last Supper painting. That's what this is. And this would have been a Last Supper painting I would have liked to have gone to because it was such a party. So in order to change the painting, and because of the size of the painting, all he did was change the name. He said, you know what? I'm sorry. This is not the Last Supper. This is Feast in the House of Levi. Another version of the Last Supper, this time by Tintoretto, and you can see a completely asymmetrical work. It's one of my favorite paintings. Just look at that diagonal right here through the center. We've got Christ, we've got this wonderful glow of this oil lamp, we've got ghostly figures up above. It really is a wonderful rendering of this scene and this subject matter. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the idea of mannerism. Back when I was in school, mannerism was literally taught as a separate art movement that lands somewhere between the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Baroque. So roughly from the 1560s and 70s on up to right around the year 1600. But in reality, it coincides with the Renaissance. It continues past the sack of Rome and does end at the dawn of the Baroque. Consider the Renaissance itself as artwork that can be defined as normal, classical, ideal. Spaces are clearly defined and measured. The scenes tend to be harmonious, integrated, and balanced. Figures are graceful, poised, and suggest the possibility of movement. If you have an artwork that does not fit into that definition, it is deemed mannerist. And that's why it's tough to come up with a definition. It's basically classical, and then it's everything else. So classical is what we consider Renaissance art, and if it's not classical, it is mannerist. So this catch-all category is tough to define. So we consider mannerist art can include manipulations and distortions of the formal elements, line, space, and color. The figures themselves have elongated proportions, exaggerated poses, and enigmatic gestures. Imagery can be obscure, unsettling, and oftentimes erotic. The most famous mannerist work is the Madonna of the Long Neck by the artist Parmigianino. And so what I'd like you to do is actually to stop the video, because this is what we would do in class as an in-class exercise. And I would like you to come up with a list of all the things that are odd about this painting. Odd, weird, different, unusual. This is a Madonna and Child painting. What is wrong with this work? So go ahead and stop the video. We'll come back in just a second. All right, so let's see how well you did on the list. These are some things that I came up with. First of all, the child looks like it could be asleep. The child is absolutely gigantic. The child even looks dead. This looks more like a Pietà rather than a Madonna and child enthroned. The Madonna's neck and fingers are attenuated or stretched. The Madonna is wearing jewelry. Why do we have a group of graces off to the left? And by the way, the artist is right here. That's Parmigianino. And who is the person in the bottom right-hand corner of the work? That's really weird. The scale is completely off for this figure. This is actually St. Jerome. And the columns behind St. Jerome, they're not holding up anything. They almost look like smokestacks. And is the Madonna sitting or is she standing? She's kind of in this almost hovering type of form. We see her feet up on some pillows, but that's really all we see of any type of throne. We also have the Entombment by Pontormo, and it's a really cool work. Again, it's an altarpiece, but here we've got kind of like Christ descending from the cross, but we don't have the cross visible, and we don't have a grave that's visible either. And when we look at the figures, we have this wonderful diagonal motion, but all of a sudden these back figures almost look as if they're hovering or floating above the scene. So we don't have a strict horizon or ground line. And finally, Michelangelo did Mannerist work, which is so different to think about considering he was the most classical of Renaissance artists. But about 25 years after he completed the Sistine ceiling, he was called back by a different pope to complete the altar wall. The altar wall is only a couple of thousand square feet, and it took him a much longer time to complete it, but figure he's also a much older man. He's now in his early 60s. Once again, it was cleaned within the past 20 years. You can see all the dirt here on the left-hand side accumulating, and look how beautiful and clean and crisp this artwork truly is. But it is Mannerist. It's completely different than Giotto's work of a couple centuries before. We have Christ here surrounded by a mandorla. Here he is surrounded by a little bit of a glow. We have Mary next to him. But we don't know how Christ is really feeling. Is this a blessing? Is this a damnation? We're not sure of his expression. In the back here, everyone is lined up. It's perfectly symmetrical. Here, look at how haphazard everything is. It is just a cluster of people. People are being raised up into heaven. They're being brought down like this person into hell. They're all various sizes, and it's just a huge chaotic mess. The people down here that are rising from the grave don't look exceptionally happy to be saved. So it's a very unique work, and definitely keep in mind that Michelangelo did complete Mannerist works as well. And our last image here with the Laurentian Library staircase, just as a reminder to tell me that Michelangelo was a person that could do anything. He created painting, he created sculpture, and he created architecture. Keep in mind that some of his buildings also fell down, so we don't really associate him too much with architecture, and he worked up right until about the last 2 weeks of his life. A lot of the works that he didn't think were very successful were destroyed. So he had even a much better reputation in the afterlife than when he was currently living and working. So with that, that's going to wrap up our talk about Italy during the 16th century.